The history of the Titanic often places the primary focus on men. Narratives highlight the ship's architect, the captain, and the wealthiest men who were lost. Yet scattered across those opulent first-class decks was a more concentrated sample of early 20th century female wealth. This passenger list included old New York merchant money, Western mining millions, and a young bride bound into a colossal American fortune. It also featured a self-made fashion designer whose gowns defined an entire era of elegance. The ship was a floating palace, certainly, but it was also a layered diagram of class and female power. 4 women in particular stood at the center of that floating world. Madeline Astor, the teenage dynastic bride. Margaret Molly Brown, the outspoken mining partner. Ida Strauss, the partner in a vast retail empire. And Lady Lucy Duff Gordon, the self-made fashion celebrity. Each of them boarded the vessel as a distinct type of rich woman. They carried more than just jewels and luggage. They carried legal structures, societal expectations, and silent, rigid rules about how a wealthy woman was expected to live. The architecture of the ship itself linked money, marriage, and status across 2 continents. The iceberg fractured the steel hull, but the patterns of elite female power remained. The marriage market and the dynastic bride. Before the collision, there was the ritual of the transatlantic circuit. The voyage was a familiar path between the New York social season and the capitals of Europe. Honeymoons often extended across these oceans. Madeline Talmadge Force Astor represented one of the most controversial arrangements inside that entire system. She was 18 years old, pregnant, and belonged to an established, wealthy New York family. Her husband, John Jacob Astor Thorpe, was 30 years her senior. He controlled a fortune estimated at $87 million in 1912. This number translated into control over Manhattan skyscrapers, hotels, and a network of layered trusts. The enormous age gap and the recent public divorce from his first wife, Ava, had caused a minor scandal, even among the Gilded Age elite. Older society women, the formidable gatekeepers of New York, viewed the union as a challenge to their authority over marriage rules. Structurally, however, the match followed a familiar logic inside the marriage market. A powerful man near the end of his life secured a very young woman whose beauty and respectable pedigree could refresh the dynastic line. In blunt economic terms, Madeline gained entry into one of America's largest private fortunes. Her role, amplified by her pregnancy on board, was to carry the next Astor heir. The timing of the return journey ensured the child and the legal continuity of the Astor name would begin on American soil. This detail shows how tightly nationality, birth, and inheritance were bound together for dynastic families, patterns of exclusion, new money, and old codes. A few cabins away moved a very different kind of rich woman. Margaret Brown, 44 years old, was the daughter of Irish immigrants. Her fortune was rooted in Colorado mining, built by her husband's success in silver and gold. It was not Astor money, but it allowed her to live with staff, travel extensively, and give generously to various charities. She sponsored schools and provided aid after mining disasters, earning respect across the West. Yet Denver society, which uneasily imitated Eastern social codes, did not always embrace her fully. Her wealth alone could not erase the memory of modest beginnings or the accent that hinted at her working-class roots. Networks of Eastern matrons maintained delicate, invisible barriers against Western intruders like her. Even travelling alone to Europe, which gave her an independence few married women of her rank enjoyed, could not fully break the social glass ceiling. Margaret Brown's trunks, filled with clothes and gifts, were evidence of how Western fortunes unsettled the older Eastern hierarchies they tried to join. The merchant empire and the self-made brand also on board was Ida Strauss, 63, wife of Isidor Straus. Their fortune came from co-ownership of Macy's, the department store that had changed how middle-class Americans shopped. The Strauss story was celebrated as the American dream, beginning with German Jewish immigrants who worked their way from small goods to ownership. Behind the public success stood a marriage defined by unusual mutual respect. Ida was not merely an ornamental wife. Letters and recollections reveal a partnership. They shared political interests, supported public causes, and gave to charity as a couple. They had boarded at Southampton, surrounded by decades of shared life, travelling home after a stay in Europe for health reasons. The fourth woman, Lady Lucy Duff Gordon, entered first class from a dramatically different angle. Born Lucy Wallace, she was known professionally as Lucille. By 1912, she was a leading international fashion designer with salons in London, Paris, and New York. Her gowns signalled not only wealth, but membership in a specific, daring, modern circle of women. She had married Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, a Scottish baronet, which supplied the title Lady. Her business, however, supplied personal income, creative control, and an army of female employees whose livelihoods depended entirely on her success. The Atlantic crossing for Lucy was less a pleasure trip and more a crucial corridor for clients, orders, and publicity. These four women represented four distinct forms of relationship to wealth, power, and autonomy, architecture, and female gatekeeping. The Titanic's architecture faithfully mirrored the world that created it. The first-class lounges imitated French salons and English clubs. The grand staircase, in carved oak and glass, performed the hierarchy of the world's elite in solid material. Within these elaborate spaces, women's power operated in quietly structured ways. Conversations over tea decided which charities would receive that season's checks. Introductions made in the reception room could shape business opportunities for husbands and sons later on. Even the decision of which gown to wear for dinner carried immense social meaning. Lucy Duff Gordon, the designer, understood this coded language better than most. Her Lucille designs encouraged a newer style of movement. The silhouettes were less rigid than older corseted styles, suggesting a subtle independence. Women who wore her dresses signalled an alliance with a modern femininity. Subtle shifts like shorter sleeves and looser waists hinted that a new century had arrived. Meanwhile, Ida Strauss's world appeared more traditional. Her clothes were fashionable but conservative, and her days were organised around shared activities with her husband. She was a matron who had lived through decades of shared life, business crises, and anti-Semitic prejudice. Margaret Brown's presence represented a complicated accomplishment. She remembered the coal dust of mining camps and the precariousness of fortunes based on ore prices. In the lounges, other women recognised her millions, but some also recognised the gap between her working-class roots and their own established pedigrees. Madeleine Astor, in contrast, was still learning how to inhabit the role of one of the wealthiest young wives in America. Barely out of school, she was under the ceaseless gaze of older women who measured everything. They judged her posture, her accent, her jewels, and the cut of her maternity gown at dinner. Behind every glance across a first-class dining room lay entire systems of judgment that shaped a daughter's future. These were the women who decided whose marriage prospects were expanded and whose doors were quietly closed. Dozens of elite women brought these unspoken rules on board, and patterns of alliance and quiet exclusion played out at sea exactly as they did on land. The ironic reversal. The transition from a luxurious crossing to a disaster was shockingly fast. Wealth could not stop the ship from sinking, but it instantly shaped access to both information and escape. First-class cabins were closer to the boat deck. Stewards were ready to assist, and news about the unfolding situation arrived faster. In those critical hours, the four women made choices that would forever define their public identities. The rule that instantly reordered the hierarchy was women and children first. It was a code from older maritime practices mixed with Victorian notions of chivalry. In practice, it meant that the physical bodies of women and the projected futures of children held priority, regardless of the immense fortunes held by male lives. Colonel John Astor helped his young pregnant wife toward a lifeboat. He asked if he might join her because of the pregnancy, but the request was refused. Madeline entered the boat alone, and her husband remained on the slanting deck. In that single moment, the entire architecture of the Astor fortune shifted onto Madeline and the unborn child. If the baby survived and was a boy, the traditional line would extend. If the child died, carefully prepared trusts and wills would follow a very different, complicated course. The richest man on the ship was forced to sacrifice his life to preserve the life and fertility of his young wife, an ultimate ironic reversal. Female dynamics in crisis. In another section of the ship, Ida and Isidor Strauss faced their own choice. Spaces remained in a nearby lifeboat, and as a woman, Ida was fully eligible to board. Witnesses later recalled that she refused the seat. Decades of mutual life partnership overrode the fear of death. Statements credited to her expressed a simple, resolved statement. They had lived together, and they would not be separated in death. Here, another form of female hierarchy surfaced. Ida insisted that her maid, Ellen Bird, take a place in the boat. The mistress, prepared to die with her husband, used her status to push a younger woman who was paid to serve her toward survival. Both gestures mattered. Ida's refusal to leave her husband and her insistence that the maid not share the couple's fatal choice. They died together. The image solidified into a powerful legend of conjugal devotion. Ida Strauss became a model of loyal wifehood, celebrated in both Jewish and non-Jewish communities. Margaret Brown's path unfolded in lifeboat number 6. She boarded among a mix of women and a few men. Accounts describe her arguing forcefully for the lifeboat to return to search for survivors, comforting others, and pressing for recognition of the crew's actions later. After the rescue, she organised collections among first-class survivors to aid destitute third-class passengers and crew. This immediate, decisive conduct formed the basis of the later unsinkable Molly Brown legend. In her case, wealth did not only purchase escape, it immediately funded concrete aid for others. Lady Lucy Duff Gordon's experience became the most contested narrative of the night. She and her husband, Sir Cosmo, were placed in lifeboat number 1, which left the sinking ship with far fewer passengers than its official capacity. Critics later accused those aboard of resisting efforts to return and find others. Journalists fixated on the class symbolism, a titled couple and a fashion celebrity gliding away from the tragedy in a half-empty boat. Lucy's own testimony insisted that she had not directed the boat and that crew fear shaped the decisions. The stain remained even after official inquiries. She survived physically, but her reputation, the source of her self-made fortune, did not fully recover. Legacies and constraints. The aftermath of the disaster immediately demanded explanations, wills, and narratives. The deaths and survivals of the rich were not only personal events, they triggered trust clauses, litigation, and insurance policies. The sprawling Astor estate came under immediate legal examination. Colonel Astor had prepared a will that reflected both traditional practice and the unusual nature of his second marriage. His primary heir remained his son from the first marriage, Vincent. The principal of the massive fortune moved toward him. Madeline and her unborn child were provided for, however. She received a trust of $5 million, a huge sum in 1912, along with an income stream and use of certain properties. Quietly attached to this arrangement was a common legal condition. Remarriage would cancel some of the substantial financial benefits. These clauses preserved the integrity of a dynastic fortune. They limited a young widow's ability to carry significant capital into a new household. The trust provided comfort and status, but within controlled boundaries, acting as both a safety net and a constraint. Madeleine eventually chose to remarry a man closer to her own age. With that choice, some of the Astor income ceased. This decision signaled her choice to step outside the heavily scripted role of the permanent Astor widow, a role that would have kept her frozen in time at 20. The Strauss estate process was more straightforward, reflecting the lack of scandal or second family. The retail wealth moved to children and charitable causes, following familiar patterns within the German Jewish elite of New York. Yet, the Ida and Isidore story acquired a power that transcended legal documents. Newspapers and family letters repeated their final choice as a kind of modern religious text on marriage. This reinforced ideals of mutual devotion that overshadowed even their massive wealth. Margaret Brown became a public character. Her mining money remained, but public attention now focused on her actions during and after the disaster. She spoke, travelled, and involved herself in causes from women's rights to worker support and education. Her Denver neighbours, who once hesitated to admit her to their best circles, now claimed her with fierce pride. The new money that once seemed slightly too raw now underwrote a legend of generosity and courage. Lucy Duff Gordon confronted another kind of challenge. Her fashion business, built on an image of impeccable glamour, had expanded rapidly across borders. The conflicting testimonies, the public inquiries, and the persistent rumours chipped away at that crucial image. Other fashion houses eventually overtook Lucille. The episode became a central thread in the story of a house that rose brilliantly and then faded. This starkly reveals one of the core patterns of elite women's lives. For women attached primarily to a husband's fortune, the disaster rearranged legal structures but left their social reverence intact. For a woman whose capital lay in her personal fame and brand, public suspicion had more serious long-term consequences. The architecture of the system. Looking beyond the individual narratives, the Titanic episode reveals precisely how several types of early 20th century female wealth intersected. Madeleine Astor embodied the young bride, bound to a dynasty through motherhood and marriage. Her body carried the continuation of the Astor line. Her later widowhood and remarriage showed how constrained yet flexible that dynastic role could be. Ida Strauss represented the partnership model within a vast merchant empire. Her power lay in the strength and length of her mutual marriage. Her decisions were collaborative, and her philanthropy bore both their names. Her final defining act confirmed that loyal identity so completely that she is rarely spoken of as an individual separate from her husband. Margaret Brown stood for the ambiguous space between a new fortune and entrenched society. Her mining wealth granted great spending power. However, her Irish immigrant roots and Western base complicated her entry into Eastern clubrooms. The disaster offered an unsought transformation. Her leadership in the crisis reframed her from a social aspirant to a moral heroine. Lucy Duff Gordon personified a more modern possibility. She was a woman who built her own business and shaped taste at the highest levels. She then married a title that could match her prestigious client list. Her story shows both the incredible potential and the ultimate vulnerability of a female personal brand in a world that still harshly judged women for any perceived failure of courage or decorum. At a deeper level, these four lives illustrate the mechanisms behind elite wealth. The real mechanisms were not just the impressive numbers of the fortunes. They lay in the legal and social tools that guided those vast sums. These included trusts that limited control while granting income. They involved marriage contracts that fused different fortunes, Inheritance rules privileged sons but created necessary lifelines for widows. Finally, social codes could turn a surviving woman into either a saint or a suspect, based on behavior witnessed during only a few hours on a cold night. The disaster also clarified certain myths about money and merit. Colonel Astor's millions bought a luxurious stateroom and a private promenade, but they could not buy him a seat in a boat when the rule placed women first. Third-class mothers with very little money, by contrast, reached New York with their children, carrying an unbroken line of descendants. In the language of dynasties, some of the poorest women on board became the pivot points by which entire family lines continued. The Titanic remains a tragedy of human choices, but the lives of these 4 women reveal how early 20th century wealth functioned when filtered entirely through the female experience. Their marriages were economic mergers. Their trusts were simultaneous safety nets and constraints. Their public narratives became a form of currency. The lifeboats, gowns, and grand cabins were merely stages on which character and rigid structure met. The fortunes those women touched have passed through countless hands since that night. Yet their interwoven stories still offer a clear understanding of how obligation, power, privilege, and courage intertwined in a world that mistakenly believed itself to be utterly unsinkable.